Okay, I don't know why that happened. Hang on a second. I've got to get some... see, they've changed... YouTube has changed the way that they do live streaming, and so I guess I'm seeing myself live now again. I wasn't for a while. Let me know if anything happens with the video. All right, I'll start near the top then, since YouTube decided to be funky. Did you see the intro or anything there, Larry? Any of that come through? Because it kicked me out for some no good reason that I've seen now. But in any case, just to wait, because I had 5 concurrent viewers and now I have Larry. Reiterate, this is the second time in a row that I am stepping out of the bounds of my usual brand. Last one was Alice's Restaurant Massacre, and I did because I have some personal attachment to it. That's what usually happens. If I'm going to come out of my brand, it's because I have some kind of personal attachment to it. And when I started the channel, it was devoted to reviews of classic science fiction films. No intro. Well, I can't let that go by for the moment, so let's do the intro. Okay, let's try this a second time. Welcome to Tales from SYL Ranch, the special live stream edition of the BitChute Generally channel where everyone is entitled to my opinion, and I'm Bill Stone. While I've got your attention, I'd like to ask that if you like what I'm doing, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, share me on social media, and tell all of your friends, family, neighbors, pets, and livestock to do the same. I would appreciate your support via my PayPal tip jar, my subscribe stars, my merch stores on Teespring, or a place on my website where you can support me further, and there are links to all of those in my description box. Yeah, yeah, Larry, I'm actually seeing something live here, so yay for that. Pardon me. So, as I was mentioning before, I am stepping outside of my brand. And when I started the channel, it was science fiction and TV and film reviews, generally very classic ones or very unseen ones or really old ones that nobody knew about. And I generally differentiated myself from other reviewers by doing a number of things. First thing I would do would be set the stage. Sometimes a different culture at a particular time can be important, you know, particularly when you're looking at these very old movies. You kind of have to know about what was going on around them at the time that would influence them to make this kind of movie, if you really are looking at it very hard. I'd also go into a lot of detail about the sociology of the era, what things might be like if you were going on a date, what you might be wearing, and oftentimes, get into 1950s movies, I'd go all the way down to women's underwear because I just want people to understand this was an event from the underwear on up. So I also brought a lot of information to the table. I researched just about everyone, and I mean everyone who would work on a film, not just the actors, it was the crew as well. Because as many of my regular viewers, like Larry know, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was once an actor. And so I'm aware that, the people in the front of the camera are the ones who get all of the glory, but, oftentimes the people behind the camera are the ones who really deserve the lion's share of the glory. And so I'd never want to leave out any of their contributions. And particularly later on this evening, I'm going to get into Star Trek, the motion picture. And in particular case of that film, there is one specific individual that I'm going to talk about who did a Herculean task and did something that lasted very much. I also did all my reviews live as I'm doing here tonight, so I could get a back and forth between myself and, Larry, you always know where you're talking. If you look in any of my backgrounds ever for anything I've ever done, you'll always find a jackalope, and a towel somewhere in the chroma key image. I always put them in. Even on my politics ones, I always put those two things in. But I should do these reviews live so I can be talking like I am now with Larry. And since I'm a small creator, that means basically anybody who wants to say anything, I will respond to you. The format was a big bust, so I switched over to political commentary and pre-recorded videos, and I now only do live streams on really special occasions like we have here tonight. This is not particularly a political commentary video. It's, like I say, it's outside of what I consider my brand. However, because of my roots in science fiction, and particularly Star Trek, they go very deep. So sometimes I do feel the need sort of revert when something science fiction-y has happened, and it's particularly personal in some way. And a couple of things this week did happen. So if you saw my second attempt at the stream where I actually got the intro out, one of the things that happened this week was that we lost Dorothy Fontana. Star Trek, the original series, had a lot of contributors, both in terms of world building that universe and also in writing some of the best stories. Now, Gene Roddenberry, as the creator and executive producer of the show, and we'd really call him more like a showrunner today, generally liked to take all of the credit for everything that ever went on with Star Trek. That was really kind of unfair. Certainly as a showrunner, he had the final say on anything that went before the cameras, and he was very hands-on producer, often doing last-minute reviews or rewrites on stories, much to the chagrin of his writing and story editing staff. Roddenberry was hands-on so that he managed to alienate Harlan Ellison, who is one of the biggest names in science fiction ever, and probably one of the best authors to ever live, period. Roddenberry rewrote Harlan Ellison's episode, The City on the Edge of Forever. Now, this is considered generally one of the best, if not the best, Star Trek episodes in any incarnation. Now, if you're a younger fan and you have some difficulty connecting with the original series because the tech looks so outdated, hey, I understand. But please watch The City on the Edge of Forever. It is a period piece that's set in the 1930s, so there's not that much tech around to kind of go, what the hell, you know. It also chronicles one of the most heartbreaking events in James Kirk's life in a very amazing story. Larry says, DC Fontana was 2 of the 3 Star Trek creators and writers with the 2 genes. Yes, I agree with you on that. I'm going to talk about that in a bit too. But yes, I totally agree with you that she was, of those 3 people, she was, you know, like right next to Gene Kuhn in terms of what she brought to the table. Anyway, with regards to City on the Edge of Forever, it is not exactly on film the story that was turned in by Ellison. The original script is, in fact, better in many ways. It's superior. But what made Harlan Ellison this angry, and so much so that he detested both Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek all the way. I mean, I'm not saying literally in some figurative sense. I mean, literally, he went to the grave hating Roddenberry and Star Trek. Well, Roddenberry had told Ellison that he could do all the rewrites on the episode. Now, Ellison was capable of doing this, although some of the times the rewrites that he was told to do, he did under somewhat vehement protest. The filmed ending angered Ellison quite a lot. Now, I'm not going to spoil this for you. You haven't seen the episode. But the original script showed Kirk doing something that we might consider that's inside of his character, but that Roddenberry thought was wrong for the hero of a show to do. So, for a variety of reasons, and I've heard differing accounts and have really no idea which one to believe, the script was ultimately taken out of Ellis's hands and rewritten by the regular writing staff. Larry says, Harlan hated TV in general. Oh, yeah, he hated. There was a long list of things that Harlan hated, and he wouldn't mind telling you about it at length if given the chance. But yeah, he generally hated TV. He got really, really disillusioned with it after The Star Lost. If you've ever seen that, last I knew all the episodes were on YouTube, probably in violation of copyright. But they were all here. I've got copies of them. It's a TV show that he was supposed to make, basically, where he was going to be the showrunner. And he was coming up with this kind of big plot idea with an arc, you know, like you wouldn't have seen. It was the 1970s. You wouldn't have seen arcs, you know, ARC for a story at that time, really. So he was coming up with this big arcs and all this stuff he was doing. And then it all just went completely down the toilet in a way that is damn near inexplicable. Suffice to say that what made it to TV sucked. It really sucked. It's terrible. And yeah, Harlan, I mean, he was never that thrilled with TV, although he did like doing things like Outer Limits. He did like doing stuff like that, but he was given a lot of creative freedom on those shows. You know, he didn't have to on the Outer Limits. He didn't have to worry about fitting this into a larger context as an anthology show. So, but he didn't mind doing that. Arc with arcs, yes, exactly. You know the Star Lost, yeah. So anyhow, he got very, very turned off after Star Lost. It's terrible. But in any case, Sitting on the Edge of Forever, it went through a lot of hands. There are moments when it gets preachy, and you can see that that's got Gene Roddenberry's mark on. There are some also very tender moments that don't appear in the original, and these did not originate from Roddenberry's hands. You know, in all reality, if you look at the episodes with which Roddenberry is the sole writer, and in particular, if you look at Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which I'm going to talk about later, Roddenberry wasn't himself a great writer. He was a great ideas man, and he was a decent enough rewriter, but he was preachy, really, really preachy. The number of writers who contributed to Sitting on the Edge of Forever is probably lost to time. If you know the series as well as I do, and if you've read the original script by Ellison that I have, then you can see that the best of the episode tends to remain intact. It's just that there are clearly other hands than Harlan Ellison's on this script. Now keep in mind for a moment, because I'm going to come back to Dorothy Fontana, Harlan Ellison was friends with Dorothy Fontana, which is how we bring this back to her. Remember this, Harlan Ellison and Dorothy Fontana were friends. Dorothy C. Fontana was born on March 25th, 1939, and passed away just a few days ago on December 2nd, 2019. Dorothy had gone to Hollywood in the early 1960s and began in the industry as a secretary. And in fact, she began on Star Trek as an assistant under Gene Roddenberry. Larry says, Roddenberry wrote for Have Gun Will Travel. Yeah, you know what? All of his episodes were on YouTube at one point. I think I pulled them down, but yeah, any of the ones for Have Gun Will Travel that had his name on it, I actually pulled down. They're not bad. They're not bad. You know, they're not anything that's going to win any Emmy awards, but they aren't bad. You know, they're not quite as preachy as Roddenberry got with Star Trek. But so Dorothy Fontana starts out kind of, you know, administrative side of things, but she was a great writer. She was a really good writer. Fantastic in some ways I'm going to talk about. By the time she was working on Star Trek, she already had a number of scripts and different TV shows under her belt, and so recognizing this obvious talent that he had here, Roddenberry made her the series story editor, which meant that she worked with freelance writers because that's what they largely used on those shows, and she rewrote scripts as they needed to be rewritten, and that happens a lot. Not just that they necessarily need to be rewritten dramatically, but particularly with Star Trek, it would be rewriting them so that they would fall into line of Gene Roddenberry's philosophy, you know, optimism. So, one thing that Dorothy really handled particularly well was Spock, his parents, and Vulcan civilization in general. Now, she did two seminal episodes, one for the original series and one for the animated series, that delve very deeply into the relationship between Spock, his parents, and Vulcans in general. The episode that she did for the original series was Journey to Babel. It's an excellent episode and lays out everything that we now take completely for granted with regards to Spock, his father Sarek, and his mother Amanda. All of the pablum that you see on Star Trek Discovery is ripping off what Dorothy Fontana did in 1967, except that Dorothy did a hell of a lot better at it. She understood the Vulcans, and in particular the character of Spock. She wrote Spock so well that in my dedication, as I went back and redid, I think she gave Spock his soul, and I mean that. While many other writers would do this character over the last 53 years, no one really has written Spock as elegantly nor as poignantly. Not Roddenberry, not writers for movies, and certainly not the hack frauds who are writing for Star Trek Discovery. Go watch Journey to Babel. If you're a young fan, I just ask that you attempt to look past the dated tech and look at the story yourself. If you look at the story, your heart is going to love you for the rest of your life. Larry says, DC Fontana met Roddenberry on one season TV show, The Lieutenant. Yes, there was a TV show that Roddenberry produced prior to Star Trek called The Lieutenant. It was about a lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps. Yeah, she met Roddenberry while he was working on that, yeah. Which is why it was a natural thing for her to come over to Star Trek with him. So Dorothy's early career was not without challenges. In the 1950s and 1960s, TV and the film industry was almost 100% dominated by men. If you saw a woman, they were usually secretaries or stenographers or, oftentimes in Roddenberry's case, a mistress. To appoint Dorothy to the original series story editor position was really rather progressive at the time. And in fact, when Dorothy first started out, she had trouble selling her scripts to TV series, particularly with things like westerns and cop shows. Producers would just reject her script totally unread because they just didn't believe that a woman could write that kind of a show. So she took to submitting her scripts under the name D.C. Fontana, and that's how it always appears in the credits, even in the original series. Producers would then assume that the initials were a man's name, and so they'd read the script, it would be really good, and only then would they discover that it had been written by a woman. But by then, of course, they're completely hooked because it's a good story. So Dorothy probably opened a lot of doors for women in Hollywood. I don't know how we can quantify that, but she was the first on a lot of this stuff. Yep, Larry says she started out as a secretary, but wrote under DC to hide her gender. Exactly. So she had her hands on a lot of Star Trek episodes. I mean, as story editor, her work just required it. Sometimes she wrote scripts of her own. Sometimes she brainstormed with other writers, and they might take off with an idea. And sometimes she just rewrote the script that needed work. So as I mentioned, Gene Roddenberry was extremely hands-on with Star Trek, the original series. He was not the only person who contributed to it. And as Larry mentioned, there are basically three people. Gene Kuhn, who was a producer and writer on the show, and I will talk about him someday, it's not the day for it, and Dorothy Fontana. And you want to know how good Dorothy was? Much, much later, she was very briefly on Star Trek The Next Generation. And in the very first episode, Encounter at Farpoint, this is clearly a Gene Roddenberry script. It is preachy. It has a godlike alien, which fortunately, I think largely due to his portrayal, went on to become one of the most memorable characters of that series. But Encounter in Farpoint is clearly just Roddenberry. It is the sort of thing he likes to write. However, there is a very beautiful little scene that takes place between Data and a very old Dr. McCoy, and it rather sticks out. If you're familiar with the way Roddenberry writes, that scene just sticks out at you because it's so totally different than the way he'd do anything. Turns out Dorothy wrote that scene. If she'd done the entire episode, or at least rewritten Roddenberry, it might not have been as preachy. Yeah, she was in writing Next Generation too. Larry says, yes, she was. She wrote Next Gen for a while. There were a number of people who came over from the original series that worked on Next Gen for a while. And apparently, I don't know for sure the story behind this, but everything I've been told says to me that at some point, Roddenberry's lawyer started getting involved in production. And that screwed up relationships between Roddenberry and Dorothy Fontana, screwed up things between Roddenberry and David Gerrold. So there was a lot of turnover that first year in Star Trek The Next Generation, not just from older Star Trek people, but also from just people who couldn't deal with what the hell was going on over there. Yep, Larry says she knew Dr. McCoy. She knows all of them. I credit her a lot with Spock, but she was just a damn good writer. So in any case, she was on the original series. She was the story editor. She rewrote a lot of stories. Now, you remember Harlan Ellison detested Roddenberry in Star Trek literally until he died, and how he thought that Roddenberry had completely destroyed the episode with Roddenberry's rewrite. And so they knew that, but remember, he was friends. He was friends with Dorothy Fontana, hated Roddenberry for the rest of his entire life. Well, it turns out that a very late version draft or a final draft of the script, I'm not sure which, and I'm not sure anybody knows, of that shooting script had actually been rewritten by Dorothy Fontana. So for 20 years, everybody involved with Star Trek kept that particular secret because they knew if it got out, her friendship with Harlan would just be over. Harlan was well known for just, you screw with me, I'm done with you, So they kept that secret for over 20 years. It was only in 1988 when Ellison wrote a book about making of City on the Edge of Forever that Dorothy finally confided the truth in him. Fortunately, by that time, their long friendship had allowed Ellison to kind of get past this with only a very large dropping of his jaw on his part. So after Star Trek, Dorothy did freelance writing for the shows as well as staff writing jobs. She did fair amount of science fiction, probably due to her Star Trek reputation. She returned to Star Trek to serve as an associate producer on the animated series in the early 1970s. This is undoubtedly one of the reasons that the animated series stories are so good. Now, I know to a lot of modern people used to modern animation, it is really tough sometimes to sit through Star Trek, the animated series. But a few things you need to understand, as I always do, I try to set the stage culturally. Almost no one took animation seriously at that time. It was considered just cartoons for kids. It oftentimes just was cartoon for kids. There wasn't a lot of animation out there. I was a child in the 1970s when this was produced, and I can tell you that basically there were syndicated cartoons that showed it maybe before or after school for a while, and then everything else was on Saturday morning. Saturday morning was when all these new shows, generally animated, would then air. And the three networks, they each had, because there was only three networks, four if you counted PBS, but nobody did on Saturday morning. So there's only three networks, and they each had their own lineup of children's shows on Saturday mornings, and the kid would just sit there and flip the dial as, the half hour ended and they wanted to get on to the other network for their new show. Saturday morning was also considered really a dumping ground. Beyond some limited rules about what you could do showing kids and stuff on Saturday mornings, they really didn't care what was on the air. If it was good in the ratings, then it aired. That was really all they had. They didn't put much money into it, and this meant that the animation of that era, which remember, was dependent on hand-painted illustrations that changed very minutely from one frame to the next. So that's painstaking work, and so they had to cut corners because they didn't have the money. They had to cut corners. They cut a lot of corners, but no more so than anybody else in the early 1970s, mid-1970s. They were cutting exactly the same corners as everybody else. But that is why the animated series seems as crude as it does. However, what Star Trek the Animated Series did was outshone everything else on Saturday morning. It was their stories. And I urge you, to watch and attempt to put this limited animation behind you, because animated series, like any show, has a hit-miss ratio. Some of them are good, some of them aren't so good, some of them just outright suck. It's the Sturgeon's Law in action. 90% of science fiction is crap, which the corollary to which is 90% of everything is crap. But the hit-miss ratio on Star Trek the Animated Series is pretty high. And the stories are good in here because of the people who are involved in writing, story editing, and producing that show. At the top of that list for Star Trek the Animated Series was Dorothy Fontana. Apparently, Roddenberry wasn't all that terribly interested in this project, other than being true to this general philosophy of optimism that the show always had. And Dorothy was then just left to do the heavy lifting. And the stories produced for this show tell the tale about how she did that lifting. If Paramount, and we said so at the time, had any brains whatsoever, they'd have thrown a lot more money into the animation and then put the show on prime freaking time. The scripts were just that much better than everything else on Saturday morning. After he did animated series, David Gerrold, who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles from the original Star Trek series, went over and basically show-ran Land of the Lost. That was as close as you were going to get. Those stories are as close as you're going to get to what came on Star Trek, the animated series. Now, Dorothy, her best episode, in my opinion, for the animated series was called Yesteryear. It involves Spock traveling back in time to meet a younger version of himself on Vulcan. So, for the very first time, yes, Discovery, you're ripping it off. For the very first time, we got to see some of the trials and tribulations that young Spock had endured. We saw Sarek and Amanda again, with Mark Leonard doing the voice of Sarek for the show again. And we saw the foundations, really, what went on behind the relationship that we saw in Journey to Babel. And we learned a fair amount of new things about Vulcan culture in general. I meant to put this on here. So for one of the things for fans, one of the biggest things was that we actually got to see Vulcan. You can see it right here behind me as it was animated by the guys at Filmation who did the animation for the show. What this is behind me is Shikar, the city where Spock grew up. The rest of the planet was animated just equally as well. They spent a lot of time really on two things on that show because they knew they couldn't do the movements and stuff like that in the way that you might want to do them. So instead they spent a lot of time on the stories, and man, did they draw some good backgrounds. If you watch through screen caps or even the show, just watch the backgrounds. The backgrounds are extraordinarily detailed compared to a lot of the animation that's going on. But this was done really well. It really firmly established that Vulcan is a desert environment, and it has one rather nasty predator whose name makes its way to other versions of Star Trek. By the way, you hack frauds at Star Trek Discovery, Vulcan is a desert planet. There are no places on it that look like a small patch of trees outside of Toronto. You know, if you can't film a real desert, that's fine. A green screen and CGI are waiting for you, you morons. Larry says, as you have said, Saturday morning was a dumping ground. Most artists didn't even want to have their name on anything associated on anything Saturday morning shows. Yeah. The guy who did the lion's share of the work for the soundtrack to Star Trek, the animated series, he did all of the, almost all of Filmation's soundtracks, period. What they would do, what they would do is we build up a library of 10 or 15 cues that they would constantly reuse over again. That's why you hear all the music, all of it. But the guy who did those, darn it, I'm not remembering his name now. He was a jazz musician. Ellis is in his name, I think. I should look it up. I don't remember his name, but he wouldn't put his name on that show. He wouldn't put his name on anything that Filmation did. He did his work under a pseudonym. So, I mean, he's a good musician. He was a good composer. He's a well-thought-of jazz musician, but he would not put his name on that show for that very reason, Larry. But Yesterday is it's a really poignant episode. Focuses on one of the most important events in Spock's life, as a good story should. And so this is why I say that Dorothy gave Spock his soul. Between Journey to Babel, Yesteryear, and everything else that Dorothy contributed to Star Trek, her treatment of Vulcans really shines above anyone else that have ever written for Vulcans, ever. So thank you, Dorothy. Star Trek would not be what it is today without you. So, speaking of Star Trek, the motion picture, oh boy. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, marked the U.S.'s entry into World War II. And 38 years later, Star Trek, the motion picture, premiered. And the anniversary may have been accidentally prescient. As a lifelong Star Trek fan with a very personal connection to this film just because of where it was, I can't really let this go by without discussing what was going on, both with myself and some of the production in the background. On this date, 40 years ago tonight, in fact, at this time, 40 years ago today, I would have been I would have been starting my second screening of this film, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. Much of the stories and in remarks I'm going to say are not particularly scripted, but I have them bullet pointed, so I kind of keep myself on track. However, as I did with my reviews, my intent here is to take you back in time, because there's a lot that's different now than was then, just in the world of Star Trek. First, to begin with, just forget everything that you think you know about Star Trek, the motion picture premiere. Forget everything that came after it. All you have are 79 episodes of the original series, 22 episodes of the animated series. And even then, people weren't sure if the animated series was canonical, that is, what writers and producers have to consider real for this shared universe. Gene Roddenberry seemed to flip a lot on the animated series, and we were all confused, and frankly, we kind of still are. bits and pieces from the animated series because of, the producers of later Star Trek knowing about it, have occasionally found their way in small places into later series. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire animated series is canonical. In fact, there's one particular episode that I think everybody who's ever watched it would like to forget, called The Infinite Vulcan. Oh, don't watch that one. Don't watch that one. Watch Yesteryear. Watch The Slaver Weapon. A number of others, but not Infinite Vulcan. Don't watch that one. It just sucks. That's where the hit-miss ratio was bad. So there were no other TV series. There were no movies. There was no Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, generic action schlock, and the dark season-long arcs that have more in common with Battlestar Galactica, or next season, another Roddenberry show, Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda. By the way, go watch both modern Battlestar Galactica and Andromeda. They are both very good shows, and they will leave you going, huh, kind of ripped that off from someplace, didn't you? So there was no other Star Trek. This was the first new live-action Star Trek in 10 years. So let us hop in the DeLorean here with me, and we'll just see if we can go back to 1979. The production on this movie, you can find out lots of information, lots of other places. The longer, unsurprisingly as with history, the longer it goes between the time the thing actually came out and was made and all the principles start to, pass away and stuff, the more we hear about just how bad something can be or how good it can be. In this case, it was a mess. This was a complete mess of a production in many ways. The first one being, Gene Roddenberry looked at this as something of an opus magnum. Nobody was sure if there was going to be any other Star Trek movies after this. He wanted to be more or less his opus magnum. He wanted to turn this movie into 2001: A Space Odyssey. Literally, that's what he wanted to make. And obviously it didn't work out that way, but that's what he wanted to make. So that's why, if you watch this film in any form, I prefer the director's edition for reasons I'll explain in a bit, but if you watch this in any form, there is what they used to call an overture to a movie. That would be some musical number that would play prior to the movie starting. In my theater, they didn't even open the curtains for it, because that's what theaters back then had, was curtains across the screen. They didn't even open the curtains for it, and I wasn't expecting it. I don't think anybody I was with was expecting it, and we all just went, why is that music playing? But that's what he had. He had an overture at the beginning, because movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Spartacus, these big movies all had things like these, an overture, and then they'd have an introduction if it was a particularly long film. 2001 had that. This was not going to get not an introduction, but an intermission, rather. This is not going to get an intermission, but Roddenberry was trying to make 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that's why there's a lot of sequences in here, particularly in space, that are very slow. Roddenberry is going for something we in science fiction sometimes call the wonder of it all. How amazing is this thing, or how amazing is that thing science fictionally? There's a huge branch of science fiction fans who really get off on that sort of thing, and Star Trek fans certainly have their subgroup too. So he was doing a lot of the wonder of it all, which unfortunately contributed to the slow pace of this film. The other biggest problem with the production was that Roddenberry didn't understand what the job of an executive producer on a movie is. Larry says, Kirk Douglas just turned 103. Wow, I didn't know that. Oh, man. Well, his kids always looked like him at various ages. But Roddenberry didn't understand what the role of an executive producer is. In a TV show, right, when he was working on Star Trek, he was very hands-on, showrunner. He was the guy that made all the final choices. That's kind of what producers did then on shows. He thought going into this that being executive producer meant that he was going to have the same kind of power over Star Trek the Motion Picture that he had over the series itself. That's not what an executive producer on a movie does. They get the funding, and they make sure that if there's big decisions to make, that they make them, that everything's staffed out so the movie can make itself, and they largely turn it over to the director. That's how this generally works. The producer gets the money, the director makes the movie, and never the twain shall meet. And this made things even worse because of the scripting nightmares that were going on there. Harold Livingston is apparently, he's one of the writers on it. He apparently quit this movie at least twice that I'm aware of, and was enticed to come back in with more money or something. But the scripting went insane. Roddenberry didn't like what Livingston was doing. Livingston didn't like what Roddenberry was doing. So they were constantly rewriting each other and then turning in scripts. Now, the pages in scripts and rewrites are color-coded so that you know, oh, okay, this color supersedes this other one. I put this new one in the script. But they were coming so frequently that they were running out of colors. I mean, I'm not even kidding. They were coming so frequently, they were running out of colors. Now, this made life really miserable on a number of different fronts, because if you don't have a script, how can you shoot a movie? You cannot do a movie, especially not a big effects movie or a science fiction movie, where you come in saying, okay, we'll just sort of make it up as we go along. No, you had to plan all this stuff out well in advance so that everything goes off without a hitch. So not having a script was kind of a problem for a science fiction movie. Then there's the fact that they had this budget thing going on. Prior to Star Trek the Motion Picture, there were some plans to start a new Paramount network that's flagship TV show would be Star Trek Phase 2. And this would be bringing back, hopefully, all of the regulars from the original series and basically mounting up a new series. And this would have been circa 1977. Keep that date in mind. So they started out doing a TV series, and then it sort of morphed into a TV movie, and then it morphed back into a TV series, and then Star Wars hit at the box office. And Paramount looked around and said, what do we have that maybe we could... Star Trek. And so they turned Star Trek into a movie. This story idea, I'm about to mention that too, Larry. The story idea for Star Trek the Motion Picture was a Phase 2 thing. The script, as Larry says, was adapted from the TV movie that would have begun this new series, Star Trek Phase 2. That in itself was adapted from, frankly, a pretty bad idea that Roddenberry had written about 3 sentences on in the new TV series Bible. If you're not aware, a show like a science fiction show will have a Bible. It'll talk about the characters, it'll talk about what your locale is, give freelance writers some general understanding of what the characters and where the place and time that they're at, so that they can write scripts. In Star Trek's case, starting with Star Trek The Next Generation, not only did it have a regular writer's guide, but it also had a technical guide that went along with that. Star Trek The Next Generation got really into technobabble, and that's some of what they did there. So this movie is based on a script by Alan Dean Foster that was taken from a bad idea for a TV series. So I understand what they were working under. They had a really huge time crunch here. So I understand why they went with the script that they had more or less completed. But that wasn't really a good script to put to screen. It wasn't even really a very good idea. It was very, very derivative. Star Trek, that's one of the things that walking out of this theater as a Star Trek fan, you went, this thing is really just cribbing from 2 of the better and reasonably okay original series episodes. It's really just taking stuff we've already seen. So there was a huge time crunch. This budget thing was going on because everything associated with this whole project, from the beginning through this series morphing a couple of times to turning into a movie, was all being budgeted off as the Star Trek thing. So this movie has on paper a rather enormous budget, but some of that is due to the fact that all of the sets they were using, some of the models, not all, had been either were in production or partially created when the movie got greenlit, and then you have to redo all of them because the kind of detail at that time that was available for TV was much lower than the detail necessary to put on a big screen. And so you wouldn't detail your sets or your models nearly as much as you would for a movie. So they had to redo a bunch of that stuff. Larry says, I bet nobody involved with Star Trek Discovery ever watched an original series episode or movie. Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah, yeah. They're among that audience who gets turned off by it because the tech is so different. I always have to remind myself, I have to remind myself, because in my mind I go, how could you not like Star Trek, the original series? But then I have to remember, we are now further removed in time from Star Trek, the original series, than I was from the 1930s Flash Gordon serials when I first watched them, probably in the 1970s. We now have more time between us. That's just the way it works. For them, it looks like old Flash Gordon serials. It's too bad, because some of the stories are really good. And like you said earlier, I don't think anybody involved with Discovery's ever seen one. So they were under this giant time crunch, all this budgetary stuff, and they had very little time to shoot the movie itself. And because this freaking script would be constantly changing, there was no way to pre-create effects with the intent of marrying them to real footage. You need this real footage when you're dealing with stuff like matte paintings and special visual effects of that time. You had to have the real footage because you had to know how to put the rest of it around it. If you don't have any footage, you're just sitting on your hands, which is what they did sometimes. There were a lot of effects teams. A couple of them came and went. By the end, they were on such a time crunch that they hired, I think at one time, 3 different effects teams, 2 of which were some of the biggest name in Hollywood for doing effects. They'd done like Star Wars and stuff like that. So these effects teams changed with the wind to some extent, and finally they got everything basically barely cobbled together in time for a print to arrive at the theater for the grand opening. It was this close, just a tiny bit farther, and then you've had people waiting in the lobby. It's just that close. And to be honest, this film was not completed until 2001. That's when Robert Wise, who directed the film, he's an Oscar-winning director, he came out and they gave him the option to do a director's cut. And that director's cut is better. It will never be a great movie, but it is better. There is tighter editing. They altered or added some sound effects. I'll explain why they did that in a minute. They trimmed a few of the cloud scenes. They have some new effects that were planned, but they literally had no time for. And I know they were planned. I've seen the storyboards. So they had some effects shot there that they had planned to do, but ran out of time for. There are a few replacement effects for a couple of things that looked really terrible, even in 1979. I prefer this director's cut. I think it is a better cut of this film. It is showing what Robert Wise maybe would have made if he'd had the time. The new effects are not overpowering. It's not J.J. Abrams level stuff. It's stuff that could have been done in 1979. It's not crazy. I understand that Paramount is currently looking at, or at least considering, releasing the director's edition as a Blu-ray. Oh, yes, please. Please release this as a Blu-ray. I personally can't wait for the thing. You release this as a Blu-ray, I'll be great. Let's see. Larry says there's a video here on YouTube in an interview that guys created the Enterprise model for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Yeah, I've seen a couple of different ones. Yeah, because they were. Oh man, the Enterprise model is just a. They had one that they were preparing and had, I don't know, 2/3 of the way built for the TV show. Scrapped it all because you have to have far more detail on a motion picture model than you do on a TV, or did at that time on a TV one. Today it's the same, but back then, you're dealing with analog broadcast television. The screen never looked picture perfect on the best of days, and it was only a 640 by 480 screen, really, just big. So you didn't see the kind of detail, and so they didn't even shoot with that kind of detail, which is part of the reason that Star Trek, the original series, looks kind of fake and phony looking to today's viewers, because they're seeing it with better clarity than they ever did in the rushes. So when we saw it on TV, it was okay because you didn't, notice that, oh, wait, that's carpet over there and not grass, or, oh, wait, that's obviously Nichelle Nichols' stunt double, that sort of thing. You didn't see it because you didn't have the kind of detail. So when they come out with this thing on DVD, on Blu-ray, I'm there, dude. I'm there. And again, the production was It was such a mess. It was a giant mess. It was so bad that Leonard Nimoy hated the entire experience. He came back for Star Trek II on the condition that Spock be killed off so that Nimoy never had to deal with Star Trek ever again. It was only after Star Trek II, well, he had fun on the movie. He thought, oh, okay, well, there's some fun in here. So they killed him off, but they had to figure out a way to bring him back in the next movie. So I'm not going to say much else about the production was a complete nightmare. There are lots and lots of accounts of people who were actually there, or there's various YouTube videos that have, near as I can tell, accurately at least described what I know about the production. It was a nightmare. It is frankly a wonder that this film got made at all. So going back in time a bit, what you see behind me is what would have been the something like the theater that I saw this in. This theater, can't see it very well, but we have a screen down here, and behind the curtains of that screen is where you would expect to see a movie screen. The curtains would part before the movie would start. This room, this building has, another direction. This building has 2 balconies, and as you can kind of see over here, yeah, it's got box seats as well. This theater, and the one like it that I saw Star Trek, the motion picture on, were converted from live theater. What they had originally been would be like touring companies coming through, theatrical touring companies prior to the days of movies. They would have these theatrical touring companies that would come through. They would have vaudeville, and so they were really a theater. And in fact, this one right here, I don't know which theater it is, but this is very similar to what would have been the grande dame of these type of theaters in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I live, which was the Stewart Theater. And it is the Rococo now, and it's not nearly in as good repair. I mean, it's okay, but it's nothing like this. Not nearly as ornate. But in her heyday, the Stewart, which is not where I saw this, but I saw it at a very sister theater, this is what the Stewart would have looked like, except that the Stewart had 3 balconies, and this thing only has 2. Larry says there were Star Trek fans in the movie. Yes, part of the reason that things were a little problematic on this film. Roddenberry wanted to reward various fans, people in the office, stuff like that. So there's this big scene on the recreation deck where everybody on the crew is assembled. In that scene, in the front line of people standing, generally close to center of frame in the background, whenever there's something like going on, you'll find a number of different Star Trek people and fans. B. Joe Trimble, uber Star Trek fan, there from the beginning, and an amazing woman. David Gerrold, who wrote Trouble Tribbles, is in there. I know that Roddenberry's secretary at the time is in there. I'm forgetting who else. The really interesting one that's in that rec deck scene. There was a fan, and I have forgotten both her name and her character's name. She did what would be called today cosplaying before there was a term for it. She had a costume and a character for herself that she would be in at conventions and stuff like that, which was a little bit unusual at that time. I mean, nowadays cosplay, oh, okay. But back then, that didn't happen very much. You either had, you had a costume or you didn't. So this one woman, and damn, I wish I'd remember her name. I didn't look it up before I wrote down my notes. But she came in with her own costume and her own character, and her own makeup. Warreen. That was the character's name. Worrene, and I do not remember the name of the fan. But she came in with this Warreen character that she had been cosplaying for years as. And they put her in the movie just like that. They didn't change her makeup. They didn't change nothing. She is in a number of those different rec deck scenes. You can see her in a number of different slots. But I think it's the first instance of a time when a cosplay character has been made canonical by being in a movie. So that's kind of a first there as well. Now, what you have to remember back then, this is 1979, no Star Trek no live action Star Trek from 1969 to 1979 and release of this film. Animated series that may or may not be canonical. Nobody can tell for sure. We certainly hope that The Infinite Vulcan is not canonical. And you have to remember that Star Trek fans were really, really wanting more Star Trek. Ever since Star Trek really got its good movement going in syndication circa about 1972. That's when we start to see the first Star Trek conventions coming out, specifically for Star Trek conventions. We had numerous writing campaigns to Paramount to please bring back some more Star Trek. We did it over and over again. The reason we did that was because in the first and second season of Star Trek, the original series, there was some danger of it being canceled. And I've now heard various incarnations of this story, but I heard the one that I believe straight out of B. Joe Trimble's mouth. And there's always been some question about whether or not the writing campaigns were run by Roddenberry, whether they were run by B. Joe. No. B. Joe has told me directly that this was an organic writing campaign started largely by she and her husband at the time, but it really took off. And so those letter writing campaigns convinced NBC to not cancel Star Trek. It was very closely in danger of cancellation after both the first and second seasons. And so these writing campaigns, these mailing campaigns, we just send a nice piece of paper that's typed out, "Dear sirs, we really like to see some more Star Trek. Thank you very much. Signed such and such," and send them off. And the point was to inundate them and get them to consider more Star Trek. So we'd been doing those for years, probably 6 or 8 at least by then. We also did one for the first space shuttle. The one, unfortunately, was just used for testing and never went to space. The first shuttle, OVS 101, is the Enterprise. Now, that was originally going to be the Constitution, but because Star Trek fans thought, hey, wait a minute, man, it should be the Enterprise, they wrote into NASA, and NASA changed their mind. It was actually too bad that it wasn't, in a way. The second one to roll out was going to be named the Enterprise originally. That one would have gone to space. This one was just used for testing. Probably all of this activity accounts for the animated series as well, because they were like, well, we're not going to put much money into it. What the hell? We might make something off of this. And so probably some of that, was driven by how rabid the fans were at the time. So everybody I know around and up to December 7th, today, 40 years ago, was really, really stoked for this film. I mean, really stoked. So here I come. And we had a plan. 2 or 3 friends of mine, we had a plan. Now, I was about 1 month shy of my 15th birthday. So the plan was we would skip half of school. We would leave shortly before noon without any of our parents finding out. And that actually worked, so check. Good on that. Second part of the plan, get to the theater really, really close to noon. We want to be the first people in line. We were third. 2 other SOBs beat us. Larry says, interestingly, the first space shuttle called Enterprise could have gone to space if they wanted to. Yeah. It was just the one they used for testing, but yeah. I think it's on the ground someplace at one of the space centers now. I don't know that for sure. I've lost track. So anyhow, we wanted to get to the theater soon, but we didn't. We were like, my friend was third, I was fourth, the other one was fifth, something like that. And then the rest of the plan was to get the best seats in the house, which we also didn't do, but for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. The problem was, with the grand plan, was that I was really, really sick. I was really sick. I'd started to feel sick, I think, the day before. 40 years ago today, I was feeling terrible. It was a Friday, and I remember getting up, oh God, I feel like crap. But I can't show it, can't let my parents know, because if I told them I feel like crap, they're not going to let me go see this movie. And the plan will not be executed. So I successfully, acted off that I was not incredibly sick, which I was. Now you have to understand, we went out there at noon. They were not even planning to open the doors until about 6:30. We knew we were going to be, it was like a 7 or 7:30 showing for the first one. So we knew we're going to be out there, in the cold, because it is December 7th in Nebraska. In the upper Great Plains, that usually means really fracking cold. My father always used to joke before he passed away that someday he was going to get a house someplace nice and temperate to retire to, but keep his house in Lincoln, Nebraska, so that he could come back for 1 week in August and 1 week in December just to remember what he left behind. So it was cold. I don't know how cold, because it turned out I was running a very high fever. But I got to sit out there in the incredible cold for about 6 hours. Because at 6 o'clock, by then, the line for this film, which started more or less just barely above where we were, went around, wrapped around an entire city block, and came back and passed the doors. So the people who ran this theater, they weren't planning to open it at any unusual time, but they had to open it a half an hour early. Not just to let us in from the cold, but because they knew there was a giant money-making opportunity in terms of concessions here. Get people to the concession stands quick so we can, feed all these people. So we got in, didn't get the best seats in the house, but got pretty decent seats. And I was really sick. So we watched the film. Now, one thing that I used to do, and people of my era might used to do, would be to audio tape these things. Now, it was a difficult thing to do because you were doing it, if you had to do it, you were doing it with a commercial cassette tape recorder that was like about this big-ish, with a cassette inside. It was hard enough doing it on TV because you had to put a microphone down to this little tiny tinny speaker, microphone from the recorder down to this little tiny tinny speaker on your phone, and then tell everybody in the room to shut up for an hour so you could get the audio. This was pre-VCRs. This is the best we could do. Larry says, Thursday night might have had some preview audiences depending on the theater ability to get those prints. Yeah, I think what happened was, there were some theaters that had previews on Thursday, but not in Lincoln, Nebraska. We did not get previews. So if we had, I'd have figured out a way to get in there. We're in there, we're watching the movie, and so we used to audio tape these things, right? I had an audio tape of when I took it to me for the very first showing that I saw. I used to have an audio tape of that. The audience reaction can't be underestimated. A theater like this seats 1,000 people. When I sat 1,000 people. So getting that audience reaction on audio tape, if I had that tape now, I would be putting it out as a second audio track for Star Trek The Motion Picture and putting out BitChute. I'm not BitChute, but maybe BitChute. I'm not going to sure what they're going to do for some of the copyright stuff they get going on over there, but it would certainly be worth putting up on BitTorrent, because BitTorrent, that would be a great place for it. Unfortunately, if I understand correctly, there was a case of tapes that my ex got in the divorce. And I think that tape is there. If I ever get access to it, I would be digitizing it and making it available, because the audience reaction here, again, whole slews of Star Trek fans seeing the first new live-action Star Trek, first time on a big screen, first time doing all of this stuff that I'm going to talk about that's good in the movie. Man, they went nuts. I mean, they just went nuts. You see the Klingons for the first time, the audience goes nuts. You see Kirk for the first time, his big reveal, the audience goes nuts. I mean, it's just constantly, screaming and clapping and whatnot. Helped obscure the fact that it wasn't a great film. Excuse me, Sony Walkman was released. Pardon me for a second. Pardon me, tried to swallow some water and breathe some water. Sony Walkman was released in 1979. Yeah, but that wasn't anything that I had by then. And also by then, I was familiar with doing this. For movie theaters in particular, going to the front row, because that's where the best sound was and stuff like that. And how to make it, because they actually cared whether you did stuff like that back then. So make sure that nobody saw what I was doing and all that. So I was just using standard cassette tape recorder. So we're in there. We make that tape that I wish I had access to today, because it's as something that happened in the past. It's really rather cool. You won't find that today, obviously. So watch the film, and then we loitered in the men's room to watch it again, because it was only this is only a single movie. 1,000 people per screening, and only for one movie, one theater. So if you want to see it again, you go to the bathroom and you wander around and you just idle there until such time as you start seating the second time, and then you go back. So that's how we only saw this. Saw it twice on Friday night without having to pay for it, and for only paying once, and then the next day, which I'll get into later. So what was the fan reaction in 1979? Well, we walked out knowing that we'd seen something that was in many ways inferior. The story is derivative of other Star Trek stories and doesn't really add anything new there. But they did do some really good things. The effects were amazing. The effects were top-notch for that era. They still hold up. Many of them still hold up today. You sometimes can start to see matte lines in higher definition. But, considering that it was made in 1979, that's pretty amazing. Most of them still hold up. The model work really holds up, particularly the Enterprise. I have to explain something to you. Partly what, everybody talks about, well, God, why do they spend so much time getting from that space station to the Enterprise? They just go there and dock. Well, the reason for that is that fans of that era, of my era, considered the original Enterprise basically another character in the show. Star Trek, when it was in production, Star Trek, the original series, they would get fan letters from, children and stuff that were addressed to the Enterprise. So in many ways, we considered that another character on the show, which is why it, for people of my generation, it really shocked and horrified us when they, destroyed the ship in Star Trek 3. We just couldn't think in terms of another character replacing that ship. It was really shocking. Nowadays, they blow up the ship with so much frequency that it just doesn't make it, it's no longer even dramatically impactful. And that is why you have that big tour around the ship with the big beauty shot detail at where they get into the beauty shots and all that. That was not just for the wonder of it all. That was for us. They knew what they were doing there. They were saying to us, here's the ship. It's basically the same, done a little updating, but doesn't it look cool? And it did. That model is amazing. It held up. The model work holds up today. You cannot watch this film and say that you're looking at a model. The model of that Enterprise is fracking amazing. One of the best things that come out of that movie. The other really, really, really good thing to come out of that movie was the music. Holy Zarquan's knees, that music. The music was composed and conducted by Maestro Jerry Goldsmith. Maestro Goldsmith, you have to understand why I talk about certain modern composers or more modern composers. I call them maestro. That's usually a title that's reserved to masters like, Beethoven and people like that. Well, I call them maestro, and particularly on this one, Jerry Goldsmith maestro, because they're doing the same work that those composers, Beethoven, etc., did. Beethoven and people of his era, they were all being paid by royalty to make this music, generally for opera or just for, public consumption, but they were being paid by royalty to do this thing. It wasn't like they were sitting down just making up whatever music they wanted to. They had to, pay some lip service to the royalty and what they wanted. Well, in a movie, you're doing exactly the same thing. The difference is instead of being paid by royalty, you're being paid by the consumer. But it is exactly the same work. You're taking some piece of action, like for an opera, and you're saying, okay, how can we put the music around this to make it work? And boy, did Maestro Jerry Goldsmith do that. To be honest, this was the film, the moment in his career that I considered him a maestro. I think it was his best work on Star Trek until First Contact. I like some of the themes that are in that. And a lot of his best material comes from after this movie. I really can't fanboy about Jerry Goldsmith enough. The music really is one of the best things to even come out of this film. The main theme, right? I watched Everything Wrong with Star Trek, the motion picture that came out not too long ago, where the guy said, oh, look, they ripped off the theme for Star Trek The Next Generation from this movie. Yeah, they did, actually, sort of. Now, the thing was that Jerry Goldsmith did all but 2 of the Star Trek movies, and his work and the themes that he created, particularly the opening titles on this, are very much associated with Star Trek now, partly because of all the movies he did and partly because of Star Trek The Next Generation. What happened with that was they needed an opening title. Roddenberry really liked the music from this film. Not surprisingly, it's freaking awesome. So he took that and he said, let's do a variation on that. And Paramount said, whoa, hold on a second, man. You do a composer credit for this guy. He's going to get paid every time this freaking show airs, because that's how it works. Composers get paid when their episodes are on. So he's going to get paid every single time. He did this work for us back in 1979. Do we really want to keep paying him in perpetuity if this show works out? So Roddenberry was forced to get somebody, the composer for that episode, I've forgotten which, to do a different theme song opening for Star Trek The Next Generation. They told him, we want you to sound like Goldsmith. And the result is what you'd expect. There were a lot of good scores on Star Trek The Next Generation, but trying that different theme was not one of them. I've heard it. It's on the soundtrack album. Listen to it if you want. It's like somebody is trying to sound like Jerry Goldsmith. But the score is just amazing on its own. Every bar of music helps tell the story. And the weird part is, because of the rushed nature of this show, this movie, getting it out to the theaters and all, they couldn't get some of the sound effects that they wanted at that time. They just didn't have time to put the sound effects in. So they told Goldsmith, hey, attempt to put in, where it seemed appropriate, put in a sound effect in your music. It's amazing how well it works out. You're not really aware of the fact most of the time that you're maybe hearing a sound effect, because it is so tightly integrated with the music that you just don't really hear it or feel it. It's not like something where it's wrong. I can always tell when something's wrong. But the Next Generation attempted their own individual score. That theme song, wrong, just wrong. But nothing ever comes out at you as being wrong in this music. The music flows perfectly. It perfectly underscores every action. It creates some tension where you didn't have it before, which is what good soundtracks are supposed to do. And this was in an era where the movies were still slow-paced enough that if you take that soundtrack and you listen to it now, there's no reason you can't listen to each track as its own musical number, its own musical piece. Same way as Beethoven made, Fifth Symphony. Maestro Jerry Goldsmith has a whole slew of really good tracks, some of which are very long, that, stand alone as their own kind of music. Again, I cannot fanboy this enough. I have several hundred soundtrack in my collection, several hundred, yes. And I'm a huge fan of, orchestral film music. I have music of Goldsmith that's prior to this, that's after this. I have numerous other composers that way. So I have heard the progression in their career, how they've gone on. This was the one for me that was the tip-over point for Jerry Goldsmith. It took him out of being a guy who made really good soundtracks to being maestro. The music here is amazing. It is the best thing to come out of this movie, period. Another thing they did well were the Klingons. This was the first time that we'd seen anything like this kind of detail on the model work. The work on those models was slower paced than you'd do today. Part of it was the wonder of it all. Roddenberry's trying to make 2001: A Space Odyssey, so somehow the Klingons have to have wonder about them, and doing that, flying around their ships and stuff that they did, that was the wonder of it all. But it was also slow paced generally by nature. This was an era in which the screen, you're in a theater of 1,000. That screen down there is big. I mean, really big. It's much larger than today's theaters are. It's a very large screen, and if you get shaky cam on those, it's just impossible to even follow the action. It's just impossible. I've run across a couple of movies like that myself. But the reason that it's slower paced, the reason that you don't have the kind of constantly moving camera angles, partly because they couldn't do it technologically, but also because, as far as anybody knew, this film's whole life would be on a large screen like this one, a very large screen. Nobody ever imagined that we'd all have a copy at home. So they intentionally tried very hard to make sure the camera was steady, And in any case, in terms of special effects, you couldn't do what you can now with special effects. It just was impossible. In fact, Star Trek the Motion Picture used some of the most groundbreaking equipment to do their model work. So we liked that. The Klingons were cool. Except for those damn ridges. You want to know where the ridges came from, actually? 1970s, Roddenberry produced a number of pilots that did not sell. The best one of these is called the Quester tapes. It was written by Gene Kuhn, whom I talked about towards the top of this as being one of the three brilliant minds in Star Trek, the original series. And it's probably why the Quester tapes is not particularly preachy. It certainly has some stuff where it could be, but it's handled a lot more subtly than Roddenberry probably would. But that's the best one of the ones that he didn't sell. The others kind of suck. They're really preachy for the most part. Sometimes basic ideas were much later used on other projects that had Gene Roddenberry's name on it. So, for example, Genesis 2 became Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, and it shares almost no similarity to Genesis 2 other than some very basic concepts and a couple of character names, but otherwise just no. Another one that he had, which was a sort of, I guess you'd call it a reboot attempt. He made another pilot that was based on the same concept as Genesis 2 called Planet Earth. Recast a bunch of people, changed some of the backstory. It still didn't sell. But that one had a group of, because this was several hundred years in the future and it was a post-apocalyptic world, they had an offshoot of the human race, some kind of mutation that they called the Kree. Well, guess what the Kree had running up the middle of their heads? They were bald and had a series of ridges running up the middle of their heads. When you look at Star Trek the Motion Picture, you don't necessarily catch it from today's perspective. But every single one of those Klingons on that ship has exactly the same ridge pattern as the one standing next to them. They're all exactly the same. Well, the Kree had exactly the same ridge bumps running up the middle of their heads. This is actually an idea that he took from one of his other show ideas. Larry says, Mark Leonard played another alien, the Klingon barking orders. Yes, the captain of the Klingon ship that we see all the time. That is Mark Leonard, the guy who played Spock's father in a lot of makeup. Quite a lot of makeup. But yeah, you can't recognize him, but that is Mark Leonard, the guy who played Spock's father. So we got these ridges. We're all just going, what the frack? I mean, yeah, it was kind of cool, but what the frack? Why do the Klingons have ridges now? We argued about this for the next 26 years until Star Trek Enterprise directly addressed it in one of its episodes. Interesting thing about that too, with Mark Leonard playing the Klingon language, that was originally sort of cobbled together by James Doohan, the guy who plays Scotty. Because James Doohan could do a lot of accents, and so he came up with some relative nonsense words that you could put together and make it sound like it was real. In later Star Trek movies, they would hire a linguist, Mark Ockrand, to actually detail out the Klingon language. It's been published. It's been detailed out by him again several times. There's versions of it online. But the Klingon language that you ever hear spoken by anyone in fandom or ever referenced, that really didn't start at Star Trek the Motion Picture. It started with Star Trek 3. Star Trek the Motion Picture just has some few guttural sounds that, Jimmy Doohan thought would be cool. The interesting thing about that is after they got done with the Klingon language, they had already shot the scenes on Vulcan with Spock. And they finished up with this Klingon part, and they went, if we're going to hear Klingon from the Klingons, maybe we better hear Vulcan from the Vulcans. But they'd already shot it, and they couldn't go back and reshoot because of sets and where they actually did some location shooting for that one, about 2 seconds of which actually shows up on screen. But they did some location shooting in Star Trek the Motion Picture for Vulcan out in Yellowstone National Park. Again, it shows up for it's only about 2 seconds of it survives. So they couldn't reshoot this stuff. So what they did instead was they took relative nonsense sounding words that perfectly fit the lips of what they're saying. But if you know the original lines, as I do, you can just watch them and going, oh yeah, they're actually saying this in English. But it was a last minute thing, and nobody had thought about it until sometime in post production. So. The performances in Star Trek: The Motion Picture are fine. There's nothing that's going to win anybody any Oscars. I think Nimoy is probably better than anybody else. Shatner is doing Shatner again. Shatner did not stop doing this until the next movie, Star Trek II. I have a theory about this. I have mentioned it elsewhere, but I might as well mention it here. It's apropos. I have a theory about William Shatner and why his acting has varied over the decades. Shatner started out as a pretty good stage actor, transitioned over into motion pictures. Pretty good actor. He's very genuine in his performances, his early years. He's very genuine. In fact, he's very genuine. What by genuine, just is sort of actor speak for meaning that they've internalized what's going on in the story, and so therefore can, somehow give a good moving performance out of it. So I think his stuff was pretty good up until towards the end of Star Trek, the original series, second season. At that point, his father died. He was very close to his father. He was going through a divorce, which I know from having been through one myself is kind of the ringer. And I think what happened to him was that it became easier for him with all of this emotional stuff and financial stuff going on for him to, instead of giving real genuine performances, but rather go back and rely on stagecraft and technique. You see a lot of that from my perspective. There was a way of training actors 100 years ago that involved a lot of very specific movements to portray very specific types of emotions. Some of that still survives a little bit in theater. But what Shatner was doing was going back and falling back on this technique. And that's why he looks a little hammy sometimes, why he looks a little goofy sometimes, and that started right with Star Trek's third season. If you look at like City on the Edge of Forever from the first season, great fracking episode, and he does a great performance there. It's nice and it's relatively understated most of the time, which is exactly what it should be for that show. Then you get into just about any third season episode. The guy would be doing stuff with his hands and having that unusual delivery. That's all Shatnerian, going back to just working on technique. But then Star Trek: The Motion, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan came around, and the director was Nicholas Meyer. And Meyer was basically saying, no, you don't either, Bill. And he would work with him and overwork him. And in one particular case, there's one where he just had Shatner saying the same thing, same two lines, here it comes, over and over and over and over and over and over and over, until Shatner finally got tired, stopped doing anything in terms of his technique, and just said, here it comes. But he would do that. He would get with Shatner. No, Bill, we're not doing this. There's a place for that. It's when you scream Khan and it's all a fake. That's a great place to be hammy and go crazy. But otherwise, we're going to bring it down several notches. And for the remainder of his career, Shatner has done some of his best work after Star Trek II. After he was told by that director, no, you don't either, Shatner got it back in himself to do good, organic performances. That's my theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's my theory. So with the performances, again, it's really nice to see these people again. It'd been 10 years, but this, frankly, was the last time that these characters were really in their physical prime. After this, Kirk turned 50. Everybody else was in that same vicinity, kept aging until the series ended. But that really didn't matter to us. My generation, we liked growing older with these characters. Anyway, my age, we hated to see them go eventually, but we really did like growing older with these characters, and we liked seeing them older, but still pretty much at the top of their game. I mean, nobody went out at the bottom, that's for sure. They went out on a high note. I do have to give a special mention in terms of acting to Jimmy Doohan. You may not notice it because it's very understated. But in that long sequence where they're touring the Enterprise and they come around for that big beauty shot in the front, the focus is on Shatner because for Kirk, this is him returning to an old love. Part of the reason that we consider the Enterprise kind of a character was because of Kirk's relationship with that ship. He would always say, no, the ship comes first, ship comes first. There was even an episode or two where he's upset about it, how he has to constantly be thinking about in terms of what the ship needs as opposed to what maybe he wants. So for him, for Shatner, for Kirk, it was like coming back to an old love. And it was for the fans too. That's why they had that big long sequence. But as a character, Scotty, who's standing next to Kirk in this little travel pod, this little spaceship for all this time, he's been with the ship ever since she came back and started refitting and is getting ready to go out now. And Scotty has always loved the Enterprise too, in a different sort of way. Scotty's love for the Enterprise is, I got to protect this equipment, got to make sure everything works properly, no matter what this crazy SOB next to me decides to do. Larry says Enterprise was Scotty's gal. Yeah, he was Scotty's girl. So he's standing next to Kirk this entire time in this thing. And while the focus tends to be on him, as a former actor, I tend to look at the people in the background. Are these people reacting? How are they reacting? Oh, well, here we have Scotty, who loves the Enterprise, and Kirk, who also loves the Enterprise in a slightly different way. And if you watch Scotty, he's like, he's going to like this. Oh, I don't know what he's doing with that. Okay. Oh. And then they get to the big beauty shot, and Kirk looks at Scotty, and Scotty goes, mm-hmm. And it's just a nice bit of acting from doing. He got almost no role in this. I mean, there's nothing that any of the secondary characters do that couldn't have been done by an extra. If it wasn't for us wanting these characters back. So he doesn't have much to do in this movie. It's the usual. Got a little blow if we don't do it. Same thing. But in that one scene, it's nice and understated. It's nice and but you can tell. There's a guy who's saying, "Okay, this is a good part for Jim. This is going to be good." Or how's he reacting to that? About like I'd expect. Just really good throughout. And I got a kick out of that watching it. I've seen it over the years, and I've caught that. I don't know, since about the 1980s, and I watched it and went, that's kind of cool. He didn't get much to do, but boy, the one scene where he actually had some emotional undercurrent going on with Kirk acted very well. I thought it was very good. I got to mention Decker and Ilia. These are holdover characters from the Star Trek Phase 2 TV series project. Now, clearly, if you look at them, if you've seen this film, you can see this is a prototype Riker and Troy. In fact, Roddenberry lifted that whole idea of Decker and Ilia wholesale out of Star Trek Phase 2 and plopped it down into Star Trek The Next Generation. There was a reason for this on both levels here. In Star Trek Phase 2, they were planning, at least this is what I've heard repeatedly, that they were planning to replace Kirk as captain of the Enterprise at some point. And that was because Shatner's salary was so high. They could pay a much less experienced, much less known actor, much, much less to be captain of the Enterprise. So the idea was that at some point, Kirk would be promoted and Decker would take over as captain of the Enterprise. The thing was, I don't understand either, because I don't get this, because I know fans were about it for a long time. Sulu having a Captain Sulu movie or something like that, right? I think it would have worked if they just had Sulu be the executive officer on the Enterprise. And when Kirk gets promoted, he would go up. I mean, it makes sense to me. That's how I would have done it. But they didn't need those characters for this film, not really. It's kind of daring, but sometimes I've said to myself, what if Star Trek The Motion Picture was good? I mean, really good. What if I could go back in time and talk to Roddenberry and everybody involved and straighten this whole script out? What would I do? Well, I wouldn't have Decker and Ilia in this film. I would have it be Kirk, Spock, and McCoy at the end that apparently merge with this, alien intelligence and going out there. If I were going to change the movie, that's what I would do. I would make it more meaningful by doing what these guys, our big three that we care about, are doing. You'd have to have the story itself work up to this, to where this merger is something that they both would be logical and they would desire happening for them. But that's what I would have done. And if you're trying to make 2001: A Space Odyssey, that would be the way to do it. Have your main characters be the ones who go, up into hyper-intelligence heaven, Now, that certainly would have changed Star Trek. And there's a big question: would you, after you do that, would you even in 1979? Would you even make more movies going forward without the big three characters? But the other part of the flip side of that is that those three actors were one of Paramount's largest expenditures on any movie. Shatner and Nimoy in particular, well known, not just for Star Trek but for other things, and they big draw, and so they cost a lot of money. Well, if you didn't have their salaries, like Star Trek II on, maybe there would have been room for more Star Trek movies, because you wouldn't have to kill yourself just trying to pay your leads. Anyway, it's something I've always thought of. If I was doing it, I would make it more 2001 simply by having the characters that we actually care about, rather than these two one-offs that we've never seen before and we'll never see again. What can we do with these three main characters that we actually care about? The direction on this falls into a kind of shady area. The direction was okay. The director was Robert Wise. He'd won an Oscar in the past. And so we kind of figured, okay, cool, Oscar winner. That's awesome, But he was in many ways hampered in his direction. Sometimes it was just the sets themselves. Because the sets themselves, remember going back, we'd got to this TV show that turned into a movie. So the sets are like halfway through being constructed, more than halfway in some cases. But again, the detail wasn't there. They couldn't use TV show detail on a big screen motion picture. So they had to junk parts of the sets, restart from scratch. One of the basic things that they got real wrong in terms of being able to help out a director, and that they'd gotten wrong in Star Trek's first pilot and fixed for the second pilot, was the fact that the bridge was not what they call wild. The bridge set for Star Trek the Motion Picture was one entire set, right? If you wanted to get a camera in there, you had to work the camera inside this room, this set. Setting up shots was very limited. Well, what they'd done from Star Trek's second pilot through all the way through the original series was they did the same thing in the second pilot. They made the first pilot, they made the Bridge of the Enterprise one room. So for the second one on, they realized that's really constricting. So they chopped them into pieces. And that made the set wild. You can pull out any chunk of the set. You can pull out multiple chunks of the set and just move your camera in here, move it in there, etc. Why they didn't make this set wild, I will never know. With Star Trek II and going forward, they did. They always made the sets wild so that directors could get in there and do stuff. So to some extent, Robert Wise was hampered just simply by the fact that the bridge set, where most of the time is spent when you're not looking at clouds and stuff, was not a wild set. And so he had really a very limited number of places he could put the camera. And because it was curved, if you watch, he does some really interesting ways of framing things, because the curved set behind somebody is actually really hard to shoot because of focusing and whatnot. So he does some weird, interesting details with focusing, where you'll sometimes see a background character who's also in focus with him, even though the space between them isn't in focus. It's very weird. So there was, that. They had, I personally, of course, I had not the slightest idea of what all these production problems were. So all we can look at is go, wow, that's kind of boring. Wasn't like the direction was so outstanding. It's not going to win any Oscars. And again, they had, I've seen a lot of the storyboards from that era. But you can't really storyboard something when you don't have a script. When the script is changing like every hour, throughout the day, your direction means you're going to have to kind of think on your feet. You're not going to be able to storyboard out, because that's what usually happens. They take every shot in a movie and they put it, well, these days it's probably digital, but back then they used to put it inside of a picture on a board. And that was the storyboard. So every single shot was planned out long before the cameras started rolling. Now you have no script. You can't do that. You're going to have to kind of come up with it on the fly, which is what he did. I think Robert Wise probably did the best he could under those circumstances. But no matter what, as a viewer, back then as well as now, you cannot walk away from it without knowing, if you know something about Star Trek, that the story is derivative and predictable, particularly knowing something about the original series. Except for the ending. That big ending did come as a big surprise. We did not see that coming. In terms of effects, it is in fact still one of the best. And the director's edition adds a couple of minor little things at the very end that was due to, again, the fact that they never really finished the film. They were stuff that's in the storyboards. I've seen them, but they just couldn't get them on the film. So they put in a couple of minor changes at the very end there, but it's actually more dramatic, I think. You could, he was able at that point when he did the director's edition, you could show the ship itself doing some transforming. So there's a bigger kind of blossoming effect combined with a boom sound effect that works really well. It's integrated perfectly, and again, it was something that I know I've seen in various storyboards and stuff back in the day. But the other thing about the movie is it's slow. It is often called Star Trek, the motionless picture by fans. It's slow, partly, again, because Roddenberry was trying to make the 2001 A Space Odyssey out of Star Trek. And it doesn't really work to do that. It's not the same thing, unfortunately. Sorry, Gene. So he was trying to make it that. He was trying to have the wonder of it all. And the other big thing was that with all these effects houses that had come and gone and the ones that were there, they had spent a zark ton of money on these effects. And Paramount wanted every viable footage, every viable frame to be used. That's part of the reason why the director's edition is better, because he's not operating under that restraint. Frankly, Paramount could care less what he puts in or takes out. So he cuts pieces. It's not anything that if you're not like intimately familiar with every shot in the movie like I am, you won't even notice it. It's just edited up so it's a little bit tighter. There's no way to make the show not be kind of slow. But there is a number of different places where the editing helped quite a lot. But walking out of the theater, well, we kind of pretended we loved it. Most of us were lying to themselves. I know I was. I think as fans, we kind of figured that the future would be in better sequels. And so we went to see this thing over and over and over and over and over again. My intent was, the weekend that this opened, that I would have seen it 6 or 7 times in the period of 24 hours. That was the intent. I guess a little longer than 24 hours, but that was the intent. That was part of our plan, was that we were going to see this every single showing for the next 2 days. So we went to see this thing over and over again, even though it wasn't a great movie, and it never will be. But we went to see it over and over again, and probably because Star Trek the Motion Picture is still one of the highest money-making of the movies, but that only occurred over time. When it originally came out, it had this giant budget that Paramount had attached to it by virtue of going back in time several years. And so they had this huge budget attached to it. They spent a whole bunch of money on special effects. And that's, I think, in terms of making a profit, probably the reason we got Star Trek II, which was a much smaller budget. Star Trek II, we probably got because of this core audience of fans that constantly went back and saw this kind of inferior movie repeatedly. So getting back to me personally, well, I saw 2 showings on the opening night, and then I went back the next day, and I planned to see basically from there until 11 o'clock, whenever the theater shut down, 11:30 probably with that movie. And during the second showing, I stood up and damn near passed out. I was going to go get concessions, and I stood up, and I was just like, oh my God, I'm in really bad shape. I mean, I was really sick. I said before, sick when I got there on Friday, sicker when I sat through the 6 hours of freezing cold, and sicker after I got home, and it just got worse and worse. So I ended up having to call my father, tell him that I was really sick, and he should come pick me up. Turned out that I had the chicken pox in its most communicable form. And the State Theater seated, much like this one behind me, 1,000 people, and it was packed every single time. So I exposed probably something like 4,000 people to the chickenpox virus. Just call me Typhoid Bill. And I spent the next week at home trying not to itch everywhere, with my mom having absolutely no sympathy for me whatsoever. And I don't blame her. Looking back as an adult, yeah, you'd have to say, yeah, exposing 4,000 people to chickenpox, you get what you deserve, And that is kind of how it was. back in the ancient mists of time when this movie first came out. Everybody's stoked for it, all hoping for the best. Kind of got what you see, and it picked up with Star Trek too. So that's kind of what we thought. This is not a great movie, but they could make better ones. Let's put all of our money behind this and see if we can't get another one made, which is kind of what happened. And it was all from there. One always has to remember that without this film, there would be no Star Trek franchise now. It would just be an old TV show and an old animated series with bad animation that nobody watches. If not for this film, nothing would have happened afterwards. And always, always credit Maestro Jerry Goldsmith for the best thing to come out of this film, which is the music. So, don't know if there's anything really else to say about Star Trek, the motion picture. But I can talk a little bit. I mentioned I'm not going to do a ton of politics. Let me see, it's 10:40, so it's been an hour and a half. That's pretty good. So I'm going to talk much politics. I haven't been around much this week. I haven't made any videos this week, not because I didn't want to, but because being old and infirmed, I had a serious sciatic nerve flare-up. And if you ever had that, you know that you just end up lying in bed, not doing much, because moving around is not only painful, it's logistically unwieldy. In fact, this time around, I fell down, smashed a table because I couldn't stop myself, and then I just sort of writhed there in pain for a while. But in any case, I had a really bad sciatic nerve flare-up, and I was just not getting up out of bed for several days. But we did have some more congressional hearings about impeaching President Trump. Why? Why did we have these people here? Why? What was the point? It came off like a fracking high school debate team. I mean, who cares? I mean, these people can give their opinions all the livelong day, but it doesn't matter. They're not the ones with the power. Congress is. Figure it out for yourself, guys. Why do you need these people coming in? And if you do, why don't you just consult with them? Why do you have to have them come in a big theatrical setting? I've talked about that too before. This is a highly theatrical setting, complete with lighting, makeup, cameras, etc. It's a very, very theatrical setting. This testimony was not for the committee. This testimony was for you at home. Because what's happened is the numbers of independent voters who are in favor of impeaching Donald Trump are very low. And it's going lower all the time. They're actively starting to feel like this is just a frame-up job and it's bad. We're against it. This is bad for the Democrats because they've got so much invested in this now. And the independent voters are the ones who really make the decision. I mean, I'm a libertarian. I'm always going to vote libertarian. Somebody else is a Democrat. They're always going to vote Republican, always going to vote. But it's the independents, the ones who may go one way or the other, that really decide the election. So the people, the Democrats, looked at this and went, oh, frack. We have to do something where it looks like we're justified in what we're doing. And so that's why they had these freaking high school debate team crap on television for, 9.5 hours, I think it was. As a commentator, I was forced to sit through it. But at the end of the day, I just came out of it going, who cares about this stupid debating team? Who just cares about this debate team? You guys are in Congress. You're the ones with the power. You decide whether or not it's appropriate to impeach a president. You don't need help. It just looks like they're going, oh, we got to put something out there for the cameras. I think it's a desperation move. I think probably it's going to die pretty shortly. I don't see them coming up with anybody who's going to really put them in a position where they want to say, yeah, we want to impeach someone with all of the independents turning away from us now. I just don't see it happening. I think what will happen with this is they'll get to a certain point and they'll say, okay, well, we're just going to let the voters decide. It's close enough to the election. We won't go through the horror of having to impeach him because we're pretty sure the voters will decide the other way. So they're full of crap. I think, and I've said before, I think Trump is probably going to win in a landslide. I think he's going to have a much bigger margin than last time. But as for this last week's testimony, who cares? Who cares? What an extraordinary waste of 9 hours of my life. If I hadn't been confined to my bed. I mean, that was about the only thing that kept me watching it for sure. It was easy to try to zone off. What's the point, guys? What's the point? Decide whether you're going to go after him or not. You don't need help. So. Well, I tell you, I guess without anything else going on in my comments, I would probably just let things go for the night. That is my hot take on both the work of the late Dorothy Fontana with respect to Star Trek, and also my take on what life was like 40 years ago tonight. The very first time I saw Star Trek, the motion picture, with about 103-degree fever and communicating chicken pox to 4,000 people. So that would be all the time that we have to say. That's all I've got to say about that. So I'd love to keep the conversation going. Please feel free to leave your comments, questions, and nasty remarks. I'll do my best to get back to you. So that's all the time that we have today for this episode of the highly acclaimed, world-renowned Tales from SYL Ranch, the BitChute channel where everyone is entitled to my opinion. And I'm Bill Stone.